In this video, we're going to take a look at the new features in EventSentry version 6. I'm going to cut straight to the chase. The main new feature is support for Azure logs. So you can now download, EventSentry can now download Azure logs, such as sign-in logs, for example, and import those into the EventSentry database, where they will show up in EventSentry similar to on-prem logs, such as IS logs, DHCP logs, and so forth. I've already have this expanded here. Before we can download Azure logs, of course, we need to authenticate against the Microsoft Azure ecosystem, Entra, and so forth. So we have Microsoft Cloud credentials here. This is a new authentication type. So if we look here, you'll see here a new tab here called the Microsoft Cloud. There's also oauth, which I'll cover later. I already have some test credentials set up here. And how does this work? It's very simple. Everything works similarly to what you're already used to when it comes to delimited and non-delimited logs. I'm going to click on Define Files and File Types here. We can also do that on the ribbon here. And we'll notice a couple of things here. First of all, we have cloud options here. So here we can define how often are these logs being downloaded. Are the downloaded logs deleted after they've been imported to the database? And there's also some auto conversion going on here because most of the logs are downloaded in JSON format, whereas EventSentry imports them in the CSV format. So we have the definitions already in here. So EventSentry is going to ship with these three definitions: sign-in logs, security audit logs, and directory audit logs. One new feature here, if we look at this, is this dialog looks a lot cleaner now than it used to, so a lot more easier to see. So all the assignments are defined here. Of course, they can be changed. So let's take a look here and hit cancel. And then the rest works as always. So once we have the definition set up, we will create a file type. It's an actual file definition. So in this case, it has the same exact name. We leave the path empty to use a built-in temp directory. And we have the authentication that we can select here, right? So here's the definition type here that we just looked at. And then here we have the authentication. And notice how it can only see Microsoft Cloud authentications here. If you're an MSP, you can actually select multiple credentials here. So if you have 10 customers that all have Azure sign-in logs that you want to import, then you can do that. And you can filter by these authentication types later on in the reporting. And where do those logs show up? Well, where they always showed up in the past, which is in the EventSentry web reports under Features, Delimited Log Files. Next up is the new HTTP receiver in EventSentry. So this is going to be located on the network services. So up until now, we've had syslog, SNMP, ARP, and NetFlow, but now we have the HTTP receiver, also shown here. It's active. So let's click that and take a look. So this is another log source. So with Azure logs, now we're able to bring in web-based, cloud-based logs from Microsoft. Now we can also bring in HTTP logs that are sent by network devices mostly. So in addition to receiving syslog, we can now receive HTTPS data from remote senders. And this works in a similar fashion as with Azure. So we enable the HTTP receiver here. We can specify a temporary file name here. So this is the default file name that we have. It gives you some information, in particular the auth ID. Here we define authorization keys and tokens. This is how this feature usually works. It's often referred to as the HEC, the HTTP event collector. You can simply hit plus here and get more credentials set up that you can then assign to those network devices, to the sender. You can double click this and you can copy these tokens to the clipboard. And finally, you can control who actually sends or is allowed to send these logs. Now, once the logs are sent and received, they're saved in those temporary folders. And we're going to have to go back to these log file definitions and set up a log file definition for this particular sender. You can always contact support if you need help setting up these log file definitions. And then it works in exactly the same way as local logs, IIS, DHCP, or Azure logs work. You simply create a definition, create a file name, and then assign it to a log file package. For example, what's shown here. And you can see here that we have a little bit more information available here as well. So once you're actually editing these log file packages, you can see already which URL are they referring to, what are the credentials, and so forth. Another new feature in EventSentry is support for Sigma rules. So what are Sigma rules? So Sigma rules are product agnostic rules definitions to help you define, essentially for all intents and purposes as it relates to EventSentry, event log detection rules. So that would be very similar to what we already have in EventSentry here. So if you go to packages, for example, and we have certain rules here, right? So we have, for example, a rule here to detect if, calculator was launched not by Explorer. So there'll be a rule here that we defined. But of course, this is specific. This is linked to EventSentry. This is not product agnostic. This only works in EventSentry. So if we wanted to port this to a different product, to a different SIM solution, then that would not be possible, or that would have to be done manually. So for security researchers, of course, that is tedious, and they don't want to come up with specific definitions, rules, configurations for every SIM product out there, as there are a lot. So instead, the industry sort of agreed to use a format called Sigma, which is YAML-based, and a fairly simple syntax to create detection rules for all sorts of things, including the Windows event log, mostly the security event log, and also Sysmon. So where do you get these rules? Let's take a look. A simple search for Sigma rules yields some good results. The main one here is, it's called the main Sigma rule repository. So this is an open source GitHub project here, and if you click that, you will see a lot of Sigma rules here that can be downloaded from their website. So we're going to take a look at some rules here. We're going to go to Windows. We're going to go to Built-in. We're going to go to Security. And let's take a look at this rule here from last year, Windows Security Admin Share Access. So looking at the rule, we can go down here, status test. So this is not necessarily ready for review, but we're going to just take a look at this rule so we can understand what Sigma looks like. But to make a long story short, this is some metadata that we can ignore. And what we're really looking at here, again, level low here is also another indicator. This is maybe not ready for prime time and should only be used for reviewing matches potentially. But this is the main thing that we're looking at. So we have a product Windows Service Security. So that means the Windows Security Event Log. The definition here is just for documentation purposes, right? So what type of auditing has to be enabled? So then we get to the meat of it where it says condition on the bottom here, selection and not one of filter. So there's only one filter present here, but the selection essentially says, okay, we're looking at any event ID 5140, so any event 5140 that has admin dollar as a share. So when there's some activity with the file share for the admin dollar share, if it does not end with dollar, all right? So this is an example Sigma rule. And what we can do now is we can actually take this whole rule here. So we're going to copy the raw file, and we can actually use this in EventSentry now. So we can go here. Here's already some Sigma examples. I created a package here. We create an include filter. We call it just test. And how does this work now? Well, actually quite simple. There's a new option here. Content filter is the default, so that's what you're going to be using most of the time for anything that you kind of write in EventSentry. This is still the recommended way to go about things. But if you select Sigma rule, then all these fields go away because they're defined in the Sigma rule itself. We can paste it here. And now the Sigma rule is ready. It's automatically validated. We can add email, for example, here. If you come back here, then we can see the Sigma rules. So now we have an event defined, not with our built-in rules, but with Sigma rules. There are actually some advantages. So you can actually use this if instead of the EventSentry content filters that are normally used, because it does give you some additional flexibility, because it gives you the ability to do and ors and also nest some rules, which you cannot do with the built-in filters. However, it is a little bit more complicated to set up. But if you want to do some advanced matching, then you can now utilize Sigma rules. There are other sources on the internet for Sigma rules. So in addition to this GitHub site here, there's commercial vendors. So we're going to take a look back here. For example, SOC Prime is one of them. This is a service you have to subscribe to. But there you actually get close to real-time rules from security researchers all over the world that sort of submit their findings to SOC Prime, which then reviews them and makes them available to you as the end user. If we make a mistake here, so if I were to say here, let's just say remove some text here, then you will get an error message here saying the specific Sigma rule did not validate and the filter will remain inactive. So it automatically does testing here for you. I'm going to go ahead and delete this rule that I destroyed here again. And we'll go to the next feature, which is digitally signing logs. So you can now digitally sign syslog and event logs with EventSentry to prevent logs from being tampered with or to detect tampering for that matter. And it doesn't work the way you might expect it to work. It is completely separate from the EventSentry web reports. And how it works is through a file action. So this is intended to be used in addition to your regular already set up event log monitoring. So this only works for, again, for event logs and for syslogs. And you want to keep the two separate. So what you can do now is you can set up a file action, which has been improved and for this very purpose. And you can see here we have an event log file action that writes to the E drive here. And there's a new checkbox that says digitally signed files. The same goes for syslog, so it writes to a similar folder, except it has the name syslog in it, and again, digitally signed files is checked. So what this does is whenever a file is finished writing, and you will notice here that we have a number of variables here, all the way down to minutes, so every minute we get a new text file. And this file, whenever it's finished, will be digitally signed with OpenSSL, which is now included in the EventSentry installation. So let's take a look at that real quick, what that looks like. So there we have a number of scripts, which you will only need to use one, which is the log verify one. Everything else is run in the background. And then we also have in the log signing folder here a certificate that has already been created so that these files can be signed, of course. And in the resources section, we have OpenSSL now included in EventSentry. This is a very minimal version of OpenSSL that is only used for log signing. What does this look like? Let's go back to the E drive where these signed logs are actually being written to. So the folder path, the structure was set up with the year, the month, and the days. And let's take a look. So this is the 14th of December. I'm going to take a look here. We'll see a number of files here. So for every minute, we now, assuming there's log data every minute, but in most production environments, you will have log data every minute. We have a number of files. And if you scroll down a bit, we have fewer here for syslog. There may not be something here every minute, but I think there is. So we have two types of files. And let's just take a look at the very top here. So this is the first minute of 9 p.m. And we have a text file. If you look at a text file and open it, we'll see the actual events being written to. So we have all the information we essentially need. So the purpose here is this is not designed to be searchable, although it of course can be searched, but would be a rather tedious process. But the idea here is this is sort of a secure trail, a secure repository where you can go if you want to verify and absolutely make sure that a specific event or a specific number of events that you've looked at actually do exist. And there's also a way of seeing, okay, have events been written during that time? So for example, if you go to the web reports and you notice that events are missing from 9 p.m. when they start again at 9:01 or 9:02, well, then you can go here and see, okay, well, do they exist here? With the idea being that these logs are written to a different location, maybe a server that's under the control of a different sysadmin and not the person administering EventSentry, for example, or some sort of a NAS device that supports warm write once, read many file shares so that files cannot be deleted, even if you're a system administrator. But even if specific events are being deleted, you can actually go through these logs here during specific times and search them and figure out, okay, has this been deleted? Has this been changed, for example? So this is the raw log, and then we have 4 files. So 3 additional files. And what EventSentry also does is it timestamps the files. So we know exactly when this log has been signed, and we can verify that. So if a sysadmin goes in, for example, let's say this is just locally stored or on some remote server, or somehow the admin gets access to, they could go in here and make a change and just delete certain data, and they could save the file again and re-sign it because they do have the certificates on this computer. Well, once you verify it later on with the verification script, you will see when the file was signed. So the file, of course, is supposed to be signed right around the time it's written, so right around 9 p.m., maybe a couple seconds later. But if somebody changes this an hour later, a day later, this will be noticeable because the timestamp will be different, and you cannot fake the timestamp. So for the best protection, in addition to signing, you can write this to a remote machine where the sysadmin does not have write access to, or to some sort of a NAS device with a warm file share. And on to the next new feature, which is the anomaly baseline reporting. So we'll move away from this. In 5.2 and in 5.1, we introduced the anomaly detection for event log monitoring, which lets you detect things like, is a new process being launched on your network that you've never seen before? Is somebody logging on to a computer where they've never logged on before? And so forth, which is extremely useful. However, what we're doing now is we're visualizing that information. So if you go to the web reports, you'll notice that we have a new tools menu. So some of the things that we used to have in the settings that weren't really settings have been moved to the tools menu. So those includes things like the database usage, alerts, and so forth. And now we have the baseline, the anomaly baseline here. So if you look at that here, you'll see all your computers that are collecting data and that have anomaly filters active. As a side note, only anomaly filters which are configured to use filter on the collector will show up here. And here you can see the anomaly filters that you have enabled that are collecting this information. So if you click on one of the filters, so this is the most interesting one here, which is process start. Here we can see that so every new process that gets run kind of gets passed through this filter, and we can take a look here and see, okay, well, where was this process actually being started first? Where was this detected? So here's, for example, an 80 insight.exe. So we can click that. You can see, okay, so this actually occurred on the EventSentry server, and it was executed by the training administrator. And null just means that it was or was not elevated. So that would be the only indicator here. Okay, so if you pair this with something like Sysmon, for example, then you can get very insightful information here. For example, which DLLs are a process running and so forth. And you can utilize this in any way you want. So this is essentially just a way to give you more information on the anomaly data that you are already collecting. Also in the web reports, we now have the ability to assign and filter on locations to hosts. So let's take a look and let's get this EventSentry server here again, and we'll notice there is a location. Then we can pick a location here. So let's go to the location of the Coors Brewery, which is in Golden, Colorado. Somewhere around here. And hit save. So now that location is assigned to that server here in Colorado. And now let's go to the event log page. And there's actually something else new here. You will see when we click in this field here that this predictive menu here has changed, has improved. So instead of having a long list of options of all the fields here, they're now kind of visually a little more appealing and more organized. And we also have this new section here. And that's where I'm going to go for the locations. I'm going to click location here. I have some random address here in Utah, and I have the one that I just selected. So if I select this now and say, okay, let's do the last 15 minutes, then you'll see that I only see results from the EventSentry server because that's the only server that has this location assigned to it. So you can now assign a physical location. It could be a street, could just be a very abstract, high level, a state or a city, for example, to filter results. And of course, down the road, we'll be adding this and adding more visual pages in EventSentry to overlay on some of the other features to take advantage of this location information. But let's go back to the management console. Early on, I mentioned that there is a new authentication type. So let's go back to And let's take a look at the Tools Authentication Manager. And we now have the oauth option here. So here we can set up oauth credentials, and these can then be assigned to an email action or an HTTP action. So all this is something you would get from your provider. Once you've received it, you want to click the Initialize button to make that work. In most cases, you want to assign this to actions that are configured to use the collector, because otherwise you'd have to actually go to the agent and initialize it there. So definitely recommended on the collector side. And if we take a look here, for example, under ticketing system, right? Normally we have the traditional username password, but we now have a use oauth button. And if we do that, then we'll see all oauth credentials that are available to pick from. And in the email action, we also have some improvements here. So we now have tabs here rather than the awkward split screen here, which made it a little bit difficult to edit things. So there's no secondary information here, but now you have the ability to specify oauth. So you can go in here, oauth, call it test. So there's actually no verification done. So again, normally you would click initialize here, which is going to bring up a browser window and let you initialize it. Yeah, and once you have these credentials here, so this implies that you're using, for example, Gmail or Office 365 oauth credentials, and you're no longer using SMTP, and you're actually submitting it to Office 365 directly. We can reset this again by saying clear authentication, and now we're back to the normal settings here. In the very beginning, we talked about Azure logs and downloading them. So how does this actually work? How are these logs getting downloaded? Who downloads them? Well, there's a new service now in town, and it's called the sync service. So the sync service actually does a couple of other things as well. So its main purpose is to download these Azure, in the future also other logs from their respective cloud website. So this, again, those are the settings we talked about earlier here. But there's some additional options here now. There's a new tab under Global Options called Sync Service. And here you can see that one other benefit of this service, of the Sync Service, is to keep the core EventSentry services running. And if a service is stopped, let's just say the Heartbeat network services are stopped, then the Sync Service will restart that service. And there's one other thing that it does, which is very useful if you're using validation scripts. So if we go to validation scripts, we use three options here for updating them. One is manual, which means that you basically just click the Check Now button to download script updates. Prompt means that you open the management console and will tell you, hey, there are updates available. Do you want to get them? And automatic would be every time you open the management console, it will download the scripts, the updated scripts automatically. And the next time you deploy the configuration, those are going to be pushed out. It still requires you to open the management console. So if everything is set up in EventSentry and you just don't log in for a couple of weeks, then you will not get any validation script updates until you open the management console. Well, with the introduction of the sync service, we now have a fourth option called automatic background. So in this case, the sync service will actually go and check for new script updates, validation script updates in the background and install them. And it does this about every 12 hours or so. So now you don't have to do anything anymore. It will automatically save them and automatically deploy them to your network if that's what you want. So this is mainly useful for compliance and for some of the scripts that are regularly updated. For example, is the operating system still up to date? Are the patches still up to date? So that's largely it for new features in EventSentry version 6. There are a number of smaller improvements that, of course, been incorporated into this new release. There's a little bit more information available on the blog. You may have also received an email about the new features. And just briefly, as an addendum to the chapter on Sigma rules, we will be providing Sigma rules by default in a package update. So you will not have to go to the GitHub page and start copying and pasting 50, 100, 200 Sigma rules. So we will provide those out of the box. And the standard disclosure, of course, if you have an active maintenance agreement with EventSentry, then you will be eligible to download version 6.0 for free. Thank you.